Hello, everyone. Professor Kurzlook here. So I just wanted to make a consolidated video wrapping up the different theories on protests and social movements, the theories that we've been reading about and talking about. So for our purposes here, as we're still theory building before we emerge into case studies, one of the most important questions that political scientists have when it comes to protests and social movements can be seemingly simple. If injustice, inequality, and of course dissatisfaction, grievances exist in nearly every society, why don't people protest like all the time? Why isn't it just what they're doing all the time? After all, grievances we know are widespread. People experience discrimination, people experience economic hardship, political exclusion, environmental harm, all on a daily basis. Yet, large scale social movements remain relatively rare. Instead, protests appear in waves, it emerges suddenly, disappears rapidly, and then oftentimes fades away, sometimes achieving the desired results, but oftentimes not. So, theories help us understand why this happens. So, understanding why this happens is central to studying contentious politics. So, um, let's explore how political scientists explain the emergence of social movements. So, rather than relying on a single theory, scholars have developed several, I don't want to say competing, maybe complementary perspectives that help us understand different pieces of the puzzle. We might answer and ask why people become angry, how movements organize, when protest becomes possible, and why some movements succeed while others fail. As we've talked about in class, these aren't necessarily competing theories. They are layered, that scholars building upon earlier scholarship trying to create a fuller understanding of protests. Doesn't mean all scholars are even in agreement. And as we've seen, some scholars create very niche theories. Others are more overlapping. So, like all theories in the social science, there's a lot of complexity here. The key insight then is that many of these scholars point to that grievances alone are not enough. People, as we've seen, can suffer for decades without mobilizing. Movements arise not simply because injustices exist, not um, even if those perceived inequalities or real inequalities exist, doesn't mean that it leads to mobilizing. But instead, because political, organizational, and psychological conditions align, they come together to make the conditions for protest, for an uprising. So let's begin with the most intuitive explanation. Grievances and deprivation theory. What people want, expand, how these change. So early theories of and on social movements focused on deprivation. The basic idea was pretty straightforward. People protest because they are suffering. Scholars distinguished between absolute deprivation, lacking the basic material needs like food or housing, and relative deprivation, which refers to perceived injustices compared to others or compared to what they believe they deserved. Relative deprivation turns out to be especially important. Scholars in the 60s, in the 70s, and after 2008 really started reusing relative deprivation theory. Um, Relative deprivation theory scholars argued that people are often mobilized not by poverty alone, but by comparison. Seeing others advance while you remain excluded can generate anger and can generate resentment. Rising expectations that go unmet can also produce deep frustration. So, this helps explain the emotional foundation of protest: outrage, humiliation, and a sense of unfairness. But deprivation theory runs into a problem that other scholars argue deprivation theory doesn't think enough about. Many other scholars say that groups experience deprivation and never mobilize. In fact, extreme hardship often reduces people's capacity to protest because survival becomes the priority. Those struggling must most intensively may lack time, energy, or resources to organize and protest. So while grievances explain why people might desire change, they don't explain why movements actually happen. That realization led scholars to shift away from suffering and towards organization, or at least building organization onto the idea that suffering is a triggering event. So the resource mobilization theory begins with a crucial insight: grievances are everywhere, but movements are not. What separates the two is organizational capacity. Social movements require resources. They need leaders, they need money, they need volunteers, meeting spaces, communication networks, legal support, media access. Protest is not spontaneous. Um, it is instead a coordinated collective action. So, from this perspective, movements succeed when they can mobilize existing institutions such as churches, unions, student organizations, community groups, advocacy networks. These structures provide leadership pipelines, credibility, and logistical support. This framework helps explain why some movements scale up while others remain small. Groups with access to funding, with professional organizers, and media platforms are far more likely to sustain long-term activism. This theory also helps explain why movements often emerge from already organized communities. People rarely mobilize from scratch. They build on relationships and institutions that already exist. However, resource mobilization, likewise to deprivation theory, has limits. It can feel overly mechanical, as if movements are simply management projects. Um, the theory underplays emotions, identity, and moral commitments. People don't just join movements simply because resources are available. They join because something feels wrong in society. And resources alone don't explain timing. For that, political process theory tries to fill those holes and that gap. The political process theory shifts attention towards the broader political environment that exists. Its central claim is that movements emerge when political conditions become more favorable. Grievances may exist for decades, but mobilization accelerates when opportunities open themselves or become available. These political opportunities can include divisions among elites, declining state legitimacy, reduced repression, sympathetic allies within government, policy crises, or maybe even electoral transitions. When power structures appear vulnerable, collective action becomes more plausible. This theory emphasizes three interconnected elements. First, political opportunities themselves, moments when institutional constraints weaken or openings appear. Second, mobilizing structures, the organizational networks that allow people to coordinate. Third, framing processes, how movements define problems, assign responsibility, and present solutions in ways that resonate with broader audiences. So, thus, these three movements are not just reacting to injustices, they are interpreting events, creating and crafting narratives, and trying to persuade others that change is possible. Political process theory also introduces the idea of protest cycles. We've talked about it in previous videos. We've talked about it a bit in class and read about it, but worth revisiting because it's part of this theory. Once one group mobilizes successfully, others are encouraged to follow. Costs of protest thus decline. Tactics spread and waves of contention emerge. This helps explain why protests often comes in clusters rather than isolated incidents. Crucially, this framework highlights the role of the state. Regime type thus matters. In democratic systems, movements may channel demands into institutional reforms. In authoritarian systems, protest is more likely to be repressed. We talked about the Iran case in class. Thus, political context shapes outcomes. So, from one of our readings, James Davies added an important psychological dimension with the J-curve theory that I think we should just talk about because we didn't really have an opportunity in class. Davies argued that revolutions and major unrest are most likely not during periods of extreme misery, but after long periods of improvement followed by a sudden reversal. As living standards rise or rights expand, expectations grow among the population. If progress suddenly stalls or economic well-being declines, reverses, frustration thus spikes. People are reacting not just to hardships, but to their lost livelihoods. This gap between expectations and reality produces intense political anger. Davies also emphasized the importance of elite defection. Successful revolutions usually require some alliances between frustrated masses and disillusioned elites. Masses alone may face repression, elites alone produce coups. Transformative change often involves both. The J-curve thus helps explain why protest frequently follows periods of growth rather than periods of collapse, though it cannot explain every movement as other theories came along to argue. Still, it remains and it reminds us that politics is deeply shaped by psychology. So we see that there are these main competing theories. And from our reading, there are other theories that emerged. New social movement theory that also layered on or incorporated or brought together different theories, trying to make sense of how movements emerge. Once we move into our case studies, we will see how different scholars have incorporated these different theories, trying to make sense. Okay, what brought about the civil rights movement and why was it successful? What brought about Black Lives Matter movement and why was it or why was it not successful? What brought about the gender movements or identity movements, and then why were they successful or maybe not? So theories are trying to help us make sense. What key pieces of the puzzle are we bringing together to see where movements are successful? So the central lesson, thus, is that social movements emerge from the interaction of multiple forces. People mobilize when grievances are strong, but also when resources exist, political opportunities open, expectations shift, and identities crystallize. Movements are emotional and strategic. They are spontaneous and organized. They are shaped by history and the immediate political context. And importantly, movements remind us that politics does not occur in legislatures and elections alone. It also happens in streets, in churches, on college campuses, in workplaces, and online spaces. Collective action is a fundamental part of democratic life. And when movements fall short of their goals, they still can reshape institutions, can reshape social norms, and shape political imaginations. Understanding these dynamics gives us tools to analyze both past struggles and the protests unfolding around us today. Okay, thank you.